This program is called Rungius Wilderness Wildlife Painter. This comes from several of my Mali classes that I've taught. I did one on the artists of the American West, and I've also done one on wildlife. And so this intersects both of those because this is a wildlife painter from our past. So next. So he was born in 1869 and died in 1959. So his 90-year lifespan stretched from, the late frontier era into the modern 20th century. He was born in Germany, and he visited the West in his 20s, and he moved to the United States in 1989, and he spent the rest of his life here painting wildlife. And I don't think it's stretching anything to claim that he is the best wildlife painter ever to depict the wildlife of the Trans-Mississippi West. So let's jump into the details. I've got an outline here for us. Next. So we're going to discuss his childhood in Germany and then getting infatuated with Montana when he visited, the West when he visited the United States. Then starts going into the field as a hunter and turns into a painter, learns how to paint landscapes really well. I'm going to discuss some of his artistic techniques and one of his later developments with dry point etching. And then we're going to view a gallery of some of his beautiful pictures. So all of these will kind of just blend together. So let's jump in. Next. Well, he was born in Berlin, Germany, to a prosperous family, and his father was a Lutheran minister, so they had ample means. As you can see, it was a fairly large family. Next. And his family was very interested in art and nature and hunting and animal life, and I think this set the stage for Carl. So as he grew older, he went to the Berlin Art Academy, and he liked to go to the zoo in Berlin and draw animals. And he even went to a glue factory where animals were being processed so that he could understand their anatomy. Next. Here is something that I thought was really interesting. He was so infatuated with drawing animals that his father shot stray cats and gave them to him so he could study them carefully. He really had a really good understanding of the muscles and the bones and the proportions to animals because he started very young in life. Next. Well, at the invitation of his uncle, Clemens, he went to Maine in 1984, and they went on a moose hunting trip, and he really liked the animals he was seeing in Maine. He also noticed his uncle's young daughter, Louise, and we will encounter his cousin Louise later on in this program. Next. So when Carl was in New York in 1985 at a sportsman show, he met some guides named Ira and Sarah Dodge who had a home way out in the Wyoming frontier where they raised cattle. And they asked him if he wanted to come out to Wyoming to spend the summer. And he said, sure. Next. So while he was there, he had a lot of time to not only hunt, but he also started painting. Now, this is a later painting, but it shows that he became very familiar with Wyoming's landscape and its wildlife. Next. He said, quote, "At first I went to those countries for the sport they offered, but then I gradually found that the painting on the hunting trips became more important." So he kind of shifted from hunting to painting. I think this is a really beautiful picture of Wyoming antelope. I was just in Wyoming a month ago, and it seemed like every half hour or hour I was seeing antelope. I think Wyoming has thousands of antelope. They're really beautiful animal, I think, to see. Next. Bold scenery in Wyoming really enthralled Carl Rungius. For example, here's a painting of a bull elk with Fremont Peak in the background. This painting has meaning to me. Back in the late 1980s, I went on a pack trip into the Wind River Range and right up to near the base of Fremont Peak. It's one of the larger peaks in the Wind River Range. It's named after the Fremont who tried to become president in the 1800s and didn't quite make it. So anyway, next. So on these hunting trips and painting trips that he went on, he really studied the animals really carefully. Not only when they were alive, when they were chasing them, but also afterwards, when he shot them, he would pay really close attention to their bones and muscles and their colors and shapes. Next. Here's a picture of another uncle with Carl Rungius when they went back to Germany in 1896. And if you look at the picture, you can see they've got a lot of horns there, the animals that they had shot. Next. Oops. Back up one. I think you went two. Can you go back one? So Carl says my decision, meaning in 1896, to cut all ties with the old world and live in America was due pretty much because of his trip to Wyoming. He really became enthralled with the American West. And I resonate with that. I grew up in Illinois, and when I was 11 years old, my parents took us on a month-long trip from Illinois through Wyoming and Montana to see Yellowstone Park, then on to California, the Grand Canyon, the Colorado Rockies, and back. And even though I was 11 years old, I said to myself, I want to live in the West. And I moved to Montana in 1969 and have lived here ever since and love it. So in a way, my life kind of mirrored Carl Rungius's. When you see the West and its wide open spaces and its beautiful landscape and the people, the honorable people that live there, it can really change your life. And it did for me, just as it did for Carl. Next. Well, very few artists can make a living just painting beautiful pictures for themselves. Like so many artists, he had to go into what's called illustration. That is painting pictures for other people who need to illustrate books and magazines. And so he developed a career in his early years of doing illustration work. Next. Well, at this time period, the 1890s, the 1900s, the 1910s were very important in the United States because we were becoming aware that the frontier was closing and these resources were being abused and they needed to be regulated. So a conservation movement developed, led, of course, by Theodore Roosevelt, but other important people were George Bird Cannell, the editor of Field and Stream, and William T. Hornaday, who was influential in saving the American bison from extinction. So Rungius was here during this influential time when America was deciding that they needed to start conserving the resources that would be abused and potentially disappear. Next. The New York City Club, or in New York City, there were clubs that Rungius participated in, and they gave him contact with prominent people. Here's an example of a meeting room in New York City, and you can see the paintings around the wall. Some of those are Rungius paintings. So this gave him an introduction into people who were influential in charting the course of conservation in the West. Next. In 1910, a Banff backcountry guide named Jimmy Simpson saw one of Rungius's pictures, and he was really impressed. Next. And so we invited him to come on a free hunting trip. I mean, how could anybody turn down a free hunting trip to the Canadian Rockies? Well, that's what happened. And next. They, of course, went into the backcountry by pack train. There were very few roads in those days. And so this was a true wilderness hunting expedition. This kind of reminds me of some of the thrills I've had. I spent approximately 16 years going on mule pack trains into the backcountry of Yellowstone National Park. And it is such a thrill to get away from all of our civilized life and get back to bare nature. And so this really enthralled Carl. Next. Well, this hunting trip with Jimmy Simpson into the Canadian Rockies changed his life. Rungius decided that he would live in this area and paint the animals and the landscape of the Canadian Rockies and make this his life's goal. Next. And in his former years, he realized that you have to really know and understand the country you're going to paint and the animals you're going to paint. So he really did what I call paying your dues. He really got into experiencing raw nature. I know what it's like to ford streams. We had to do that in a lot of the backcountry crossings in Yellowstone. Next. While he was on these trips, he always was sketching, drawing. This was something he had to do practically every day. And here's like a sheet from one of his sketchbooks. Next. Frederick Remington, who by that time, well, actually Frederick Remington died in 1909, so he was older than Rungius. Remington was very, very impressed. Remington was impressed with Rungius's artwork and so as this quote shows here, Remington is saying, "This man knows our big game animals and he knows their backgrounds and he paints them and look all right to me, and I'm going to own one of these someday." I'm not sure that he did, but a Carl Rungius painting stacks up very favorably to any painting that Frederick Remington ever did. So they're in the same class, in my opinion. Next. Well, if you remember, I mentioned he met his 14-year-old cousin, Louise. Well, they finally got married in 1907. This was more common in the past, marrying your cousins. And she went on many trips with him into the backcountry. So she was quite a spouse and supported him in his artwork. Next. And I should mention, they did get married. She was 28 and he was 38, so he wasn't robbing the cradle. And as I mentioned, the field work was essential. If you look in the lower right-hand picture, you'll see he's got propped up on a little box there, a bighorn sheep head that he's sketching. Next. And I found this interesting. He made a tripod and hung this moose head so that he could draw it and have it hold still. Next. So he really, really understood his subject. Next. I call this slide Shades of John James Audubon. You know, Audubon is a conservation society. I'm a member of the local chapter of the Five Valleys Audubon Society. And if you delve very deeply into Audubon's history, you'll learn that all of the birds that he painted, not all of them, most of the birds that he painted, he had to kill them and then he would draw them. He'd wire them up so that he could see them as, in a more natural pose. But Audubon probably killed thousands of birds in his life, because back then that was the only way. They didn't have good binoculars. And so the same thing is true with Rungius. If he understands animals and knows how to paint them, it's because he was a hunter. He killed a lot of them and he studied them. But this is the way it had to be for people to truly understand them. Next. I find Rungius's ability is really well demonstrated in these oil sketches. 8 by 10 inch little canvases, you know, that's smaller than a piece of typing paper. He can take and in like 1 hour paint these pictures that you see here and just get the essence of them. And it's really incredible how few brush strokes and how quickly he could do it. And yet, don't these look so real and lifelike and perfect in their proportions and in their shading? Next. Well, as I said earlier, he spent the 50 years of his life painting in the Canadian Rockies. He and his wife bought a house in Banff, and he spent half his year, I'm sure it was during the warmer half of the year, in the Banff area. And then the other half of the year was spent in New York City, where he worked on finishing larger canvases from his field sketches and making the connections to market his art. He wound up leading a very financially secure life, split like this between the raw nature of the Canadian Rockies and the civilized life of New York City. Next. A really important part of Rungius's success was his ability as a landscape artist. Here we see the lower falls of the Yellowstone. It's, for me, when I look at a Rungius painting, and you're going to see lots, you've already seen some, and you're going to see so many more beautiful ones here before we're done. The setting, the landscape behind the animals, I think is just as superior, just as excellent as his ability to paint the animal itself. So let's delve into that. Next. Just as he always was sketching wild animals, live or dead when he could, he was constantly painting the landscape, mostly in field sketches, and then you go into your studio and do more final large canvases that took a lot longer time. But I've got this photograph here showing him on I believe it's the Bow River in the Canadian Rockies, and you can see the painting in the upper left corner there. That's probably the same mountain that he was sketching that day. Next. So the landscapes and animals harmoniously concur. This is a book that I'm going to show you when I'm done here. He really marries the animals with the landscape. You can see in the upper left-hand corner one of his 8 by 10 inch, probably 1 or 2 hour sketches. And then he put that into the background for his moose painting, as you can see. Next. So I got a couple of samples here of his field sketches, which in their own right, I think are very beautiful paintings. But for most artists, a field sketch is not something they'd ever want to show somebody or sell, but it really demonstrates, I think, his ability to capture very artistically and beautifully a landscape with just a minimal number of strokes. So let's see a couple more. Next. Here's another small one. You can almost see the brush strokes. Next. Now, one of the things I think Rungius really mastered was the ability to create patterns not only on the fur of the animals, but the brush, the grass, the sedges, the foliage of the plants. When you look up close to his paintings, they just seem like blobs of paint. But just like impressionists, when you stand back, your eye kind of merges them in to what the artist was trying to get you to think was there. So this looks like a lot of, leafy brush country that these moose are in. You get up close to it, and it's just a mishmash of blobby uh, splots of paint. He's not really painting any leaf indirectly. He's just suggesting it through these impressionistic techniques, which of course were made famous by the French Impressionists. Next. So here's an example of Carl in his studio. You notice in the upper left there, there's a field sketch he did of bighorn sheep. In the middle on the left there, one of his smaller landscape sketches. And then down on the lower right, you'll notice he did like a preliminary drawing with these lines. And I'm going to talk a little bit later here about the importance of those lines in his artwork. But his finished painting there is in the middle of the picture. So there's a lot of work behind creating a fine, beautiful oil painting. Next. Dynamic symmetry. Well, this is really a strong element in Carl Rungius's paintings. Once you're told to notice this, you'll begin to see that the vast majority of his paintings, especially in his mature years, always had a lot of diagonals. There was very little horizontalness in his picture. So you can see how the elk in this painting right here is right at where the two diagonals of the mountains come together. Next. Here's an earlier painting. Notice the practically level horizon and the vertical tree. That pretty much disappears by the time he gets to his mature years in the Canadian Rockies. That's not a bad painting, but I think as you're going to see, the dynamic nature of diagonals comports so well with his wildlife and landscape union. Next. This dynamic symmetry wasn't invented by him. It was articulated by a man named J. Hambridge, who was a Canadian illustrator who wrote a manuscript on it, and he lectured on it. I don't know if Rungius actually attended that lecture, but he sure embodied this concept of dynamic symmetry, which in its simplest form talks about the use of diagonals. Again, notice the left and right diagonals coming together where the animal is. Next. Here's another really beautiful example of a grizzly bear. I actually have a really fine print of that I framed, that I've sold to a couple of people. Next. Once again, we got so many diagonals here in the background. Not only the mountain, the light coming through the trees, even the stream is going diagonally through the picture. None of this is by accident. He is carefully planning all of the composition of his paintings. And the low angled sunlight coming in, that's a favorite technique, not only of painters, but of photographers. Next. Once again, notice how beautiful it is with the sweeping diagonals of the composition. Next. Another important factor that I like to point out about Carl Rungius's paintings is value contrast. When you look at a picture that's in color and you translate it into shades of gray, white and gray to black, in other words, remove the color and just look at the shades, you will find that he put the focal point of his paintings right where there was a lot of contrast. When you look at this picture, let's go to the next one. Next slide. Here we are with all the color removed. What animal do you see? Of course, it's the one up in the top there with the dark against the light. So Rungius is very carefully using value, that is the lightness and darkness in his color palette, to draw attention to the animal that he wants you to see. So let's look at that in some next slides here. Next.